Ancient Egypt is one of the most fascinating periods of history, but what was daily life like there? What did people eat? What were their jobs? And most importantly, how did they use the toilet? Well, that's what we'll be looking at today. So come with me on this journey back in time. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to explore ancient Egypt from the perspective of daily life. We will learn about pharaohs, priests, scribes, artisans, farmers and domestic servants and get an idea of what their daily life would have been like. It should be noted that there was a huge gap between the rich and poor in ancient Egypt. While the pharaohs and the wealthy elite enjoyed luxury and power, the majority of the population, including the slaves, were impoverished. So let's begin our exploration with the pharaoh. The pharaoh was considered both the political and religious leader of ancient Egypt. He owned all the land and everyone on it, and his word was law. The pharaoh's main responsibilities included maintaining order, protecting the realm from invaders, overseeing construction projects such as temples and pyramids, and most importantly, keeping the country prosperous and ensuring the continuation of its traditions and customs. The pharaoh was seen as a god on earth, and thus he was expected to live a life of luxury and privilege. This meant that he had access to the finest food and clothing and lived in opulent palaces. But being a pharaoh wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. In fact, it was quite stressful. They had to make sure that the gods were happy with them or else they would be overthrown. And let's not forget the pressure of having an entire kingdom resting on your shoulders. Can you imagine the stress of knowing that if you don't do a good job, your people could starve or worse, be wiped out by an invading army? Not to mention the danger that came with the job, as many pharaohs met their end on the battlefield or at the hands of their own family members, vying for the throne. It was a tough gig, but someone had to do it. So let's move on to someone who had a much easier job, the Egyptian priest. Priests were responsible for performing religious ceremonies, making sacrifices to the gods and taking care of the temples. Unlike the pharaoh, priests didn't have to worry about the well-being of an entire kingdom, just the well-being of the gods. Easy peasy. Okay, maybe not so easy. Depending on which god they served, priests had to follow a strict code of conduct and abstain from certain things like alcohol and sex. Plus, they had to wake up before the sun to perform their daily rituals. But hey, at least they didn't have to deal with pesky peasants complaining about their taxes. Priests were highly respected in society and often enjoyed a high standard of living. After all, they were the ones keeping the gods happy and ensuring the pharaoh's divine right to rule. And let's not forget about the free food and fancy robes. Not a bad gig if you can get it. Next up, we have the scribe. Scribes were responsible for recording important information such as births, deaths, and transactions. They were also responsible for keeping track of the pharaoh's taxes. To become a scribe, you had to go through years of training because they were the only ones allowed to read and write. In ancient Egypt, literacy was a rare skill and scribes were highly valued for their ability to communicate both orally and in writing. Scribes were typically employed by the government or wealthy landowners, and their work was essential for the smooth functioning of society. They were responsible for keeping records of everything from births and deaths to tax payments and trade transactions. They also served as secretaries to the pharaoh and high officials, drafting important documents and correspondence. Now, while scribes were highly respected and valued members of society, they weren't exactly rolling in dough. In fact, they were typically employed by the government or wealthy landowners and their salaries were pretty modest. But hey, at least they got to wear fancy linen clothes and had access to some pretty sweet titles like chief of the scribe's house or overseer of the royal library. Not too shabby. Let's talk about the artisans of ancient Egypt. These were the creative types, the builders, the sculptors, and the jewelers who created some of the most beautiful works of art in history. Their job was to build the pyramids, temples and tombs that made ancient Egypt so iconic. And let's not forget about their day jobs, like making beer and sandals. These guys were the OG multitaskers. Being an artisan wasn't all fun and games, though. It was hard, dangerous work that required long hours and a lot of physical endurance. Working conditions were often cramped and dusty and there were plenty of accidents waiting to happen. Plus, they had to work closely with the supervisors to make sure their creations met the pharaoh's expectations. If they messed up, they could be punished severely. Despite the challenges, artisans were an integral part of ancient Egyptian society. Their skills were essential for the construction of the monumental structures that still stand today, and their craftsmanship was highly prized by the elite. Now let's move on to the farmers. Farmers were the backbone of ancient Egyptian society. They grew the food that everyone ate and kept the country running smoothly. They worked long and hard hours planting and harvesting crops and taking care of livestock. Most of the year was spent planting and tending to crops. Farmers would use tools such as sickles and plows to plant and harvest crops such as wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. During the flood season, farmers would help to protect their fields from flooding by building dikes and levees. When the Nile River flooded, it deposited silt that made the soil extra fertile. So farmers had to hurry up and plant their crops so they could take advantage of the fertile soil. The harvest season was also busy as farmers worked long hours to gather in the crops before they spoiled. They would use sickles to cut the grain and then threshed by beating the stalks with sticks until the grain was separated. Farmers were an essential part of ancient Egyptian society, and their work was vital for the survival of the kingdom. Without their hard work, there would be no food for the people or the animals, and the country would fall into chaos. But hey, at least they got to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Egyptian farmers typically ate a diet of bread, beer, vegetables, and fruit. They also kept animals such as chickens, pigs, and cattle, which provided them with meat, milk, and eggs. Not bad for a peasant. Finally, we have the domestic servants. Domestic servants were responsible for cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the household. They worked long and hard hours and were often treated poorly. In fact, some historians argue that slavery in ancient Egypt was actually a necessary evil to keep society functioning. Hey, at least they had a job. There were plenty of unemployed people in ancient Egypt, especially during times of famine. And let's not forget about the cool stuff they got to see, as domestic servants often had access to parts of the palace or temple that were off limits to the general public. For example, they might have seen the pharaoh's treasure or the mummification process firsthand. Now, this might not sound like a perk to you, seeing a dead body wrapped in bandages, but to those living in ancient Egypt, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And there you have it, a glimpse into the daily life of ordinary people in ancient Egypt. From the luxurious life of the pharaoh to the humble existence of the peasant, ancient Egypt was a land of extremes. It's hard to imagine the vast differences in lifestyle between the rulers and the ruled, but it's important to remember that history is full of disparities. So the next time you find yourself complaining about your own daily grind, just remember, at least you're not a peasant in ancient Egypt.